You're learning with 9 to 5 English. Business English for the workplace. Hi, Tim here with another 9 to 5 English lesson. Today's lesson will be our first to focus on English phrasal verbs. And we're going to kick off with some phrasal verbs for talking about beginnings. If you're not sure what a phrasal verb is, well, I just used one. I said we're going to kick off. Kick off is a phrasal verb because it has a verb, kick, and a preposition, off. And when used together, the meaning is different from the individual words. There are hundreds of these little two-word combinations in English. We use them all the time, and their meaning isn't always clear from the two words they're made of. So it's a great idea to study them. In our example, to kick off means to start or begin. And just like the verb start, we can either say that an event kicks off or that we kick off an event. Let's try a bit of practice with this phrasal verb. Listen to each example, then repeat it yourself.
The event kicks off this morning at 8 a.m.
We're going to kick our conference off with a great speaker.
In that first example, kick and off stayed together. But in the second example, those two words were split, as in kick our conference off. Some phrasal verbs can be split like this. Some can't. And some, like kick off, can be used both ways. So when you learn a new phrasal verb, it can be a good idea to make note of whether it can be split like this. There's another common phrasal verb that has basically the same meaning as to kick off, and that's to start off. But with start off, we usually give some more explanation of what's happening. We might say, let's start the meeting off with some introductions. And while kick off is often used with events or things with an official start, the phrasal verb to start off is used to describe the beginning of a journey or a process. Let's try some examples with to start off. Remember to repeat the examples after you hear them.
I'd like to start this meeting off by reviewing the agenda.
We will start off on our trip to Chicago tomorrow.
Now, I don't want you to think you can just change the preposition and keep the same meaning or sense. One tricky thing about phrasal verbs is that you can have one verb with many different prepositions, and each combination has a different meaning. For example, we just looked at to start off, but we might also use the phrasal verb to start up. However, they're not used in exactly the same way. If you start something up, you're not beginning a meeting or a journey or a process. Instead, you're starting a business or a machine. If you start up a business, you are creating a new one. And if you start up a machine, you are turning it on. How about some practice with this phrasal verb? Once again, repeat the examples after you hear them.
Susan left our company last year to start up her own business.
When I arrive at the office each day, I start up my laptop.
So, you can start up a new business. But do you think you can start up a new hobby or some activity that you do in your free time? Does it sound right to say something like, I recently started up swimming on weekends? In fact, no, we can't say that. For hobbies, we use a different phrasal verb, to take up. So you can say, I recently took up swimming on weekends. But here's another tricky thing about phrasal verbs. Sometimes the same phrasal verb can have different meanings. To take up doesn't just mean to start a new hobby. We also use it to talk about how much space or time something uses. Like, responding to email takes up so much time. Let's practice to take up with a couple of examples, one for each of these meanings. Repeat the examples after you hear them.
Last year, I took up gardening in my free time.
This table takes up too much space in our office.
Great work! We've practiced several phrasal verbs to talk about beginnings. But how do these sound in a conversation? Let's listen to a short conversation between Tom and Bonnie. They're talking about a speech that Bonnie is preparing for.
So, how are you going to start your speech?
I think I'm going to kick off with a story.
A story? I guess that's not a bad idea.
Yeah, I want to start off with something interesting.
Now it's your turn to practice. We'll repeat the dialogue, but this time we're going to beep out the second speaker's words. You will have to say those parts yourself. Remember to start by saying you're going to kick off with a story. Then explain that you want to start off with something interesting. Ready? Here we go.
So, how are you going to start your speech? A story? I guess that's not a bad idea.
Okay, that's all for this lesson. Our first with a focus on phrasal verbs. We've learned how to use several phrasal verbs related to beginnings, including to kick off, to start off, to start up, and to take up. We'll be back soon with some more useful English expressions. Until then, so long and happy learning. You're learning with 9 to 5 English. Business English for the workplace. Hi, Tim here with another 9 to 5 English lesson. In today's lesson, we're going to look at phrasal verbs for changing the topic. Remember, a phrasal verb is just a combination of a verb and a preposition with a special meaning. Last time we looked at some phrasal verbs related to beginnings. Today, I want to turn to phrasal verbs for changing the topic of conversation. Did you hear me just say we will turn to a new set of phrasal verbs? Well, turn to is one common phrasal verb that we use to change the topic of conversation. We're not turning our actual body or head in this case. We're turning our attention to a new topic. Let's try a bit of practice with this phrasal verb. Listen to each example, then repeat it yourself.
Okay, next I think we should turn to the sales report.
So, turning to projects, any updates from the development team?
As you can hear, when we use turn to change the topic, it is always followed by a description of the new topic. But what if you want to change the topic, but you don't want to specify which topic? Well, in that case, you can say you want to move on. That just means you want to go to the next thing. It could be an activity or a topic. So you could just say you want to move on with nothing else after it. Or you could say move on to plus the next activity or topic. Let's try some examples with to move on. Remember to repeat the examples after you hear them.
Before we move on to look at finances, are there any more questions?
It doesn't look like we're going to agree on this, so let's move on.
We've been looking at ways to move on to a new topic. But what if you're in a conversation or meeting and you want to talk about something that you've already discussed? Or the conversation moves away from the topic you want to talk about? In this case, we can use circle back to or get back to a particular topic. That just means that you want to talk about something you were previously discussing. That's useful when you're in a meeting and people start talking about something that isn't on the agenda. How about some practice with using get back to or circle back to? Once again, repeat the examples after you hear them.
Maybe at the end of the meeting, we can circle back to this issue.
I'm sorry, but can we get back to the budget here?
Now, remember, many phrasal verbs have more than one meaning. That's true about one that we just practiced, to get back. We used it to mean to return to a topic. But that's not the only meaning. Get back is also what you do when someone returns something they borrowed from you. If you borrow my pen, later I'll want to get it back from you. Yet another meaning for get back is to move back. So when someone says get back, they want you to move away from them. Let's practice using to get back with a couple of examples. Repeat the examples after you hear them.
I loaned my car to Dave and need to get it back.
The security guard told the crowd to get back.
Okay, so we've practiced several phrasal verbs for changing the topic. But how do these sound in a conversation? Let's listen to a short conversation between Kimmy and Adam. They are in a meeting discussing several topics.
So, I think we're done talking about the budget.
Yes, let's move on to the staffing situation.
Okay, and is there anything else we need to discuss?
Maybe at the end of the meeting we can get back to the schedule?
Now it's your turn to practice. We'll repeat the dialogue, but this time we're going to beep out the second speaker's words. You will have to say those parts yourself remember to start by saying you want to move on to the staffing situation. Then you will suggest getting back to the schedule at the end of the meeting. Ready? Here we go.
So, I think we're done talking about the budget. Okay, and is there anything else we need to discuss?
Okay, that's all for this lesson, our second with a focus on phrasal verbs. We've learned how to use several phrasal verbs related to switching topics, including to turn to get back to, or to circle back to, and to move on. We'll be back soon with some more useful English expressions. Until then, so long and happy learning. You're learning with 9 to 5 English. Business English for the workplace. Hi, Tim here with another 9 to 5 English lesson. In today's lesson, we're going to look at phrasal verbs for investigating. In case you forgot, a phrasal verb is an expression with a verb and a preposition. You hear them used all the time by English speakers. In fact, I just used one, to look at, meaning to examine something. And in this lesson, we'll be looking at other phrasal verbs related to investigating or examining an idea or situation. Later, you can check out some of our other lessons on phrasal verbs. Whoa, I just did it again. I said you can check out some other lessons. Now, I bet you've heard this phrasal verb, check out, before. It's a very common one for talking about examining or investigating something. If you check something, you're looking at it to see if it's correct. But if you check out something, it means you're just looking at it out of interest. Maybe you want to check out a new part of town or check out what a colleague's working on. Let's try some practice with this phrasal verb, to check out. Listen to each example, then repeat it yourself. Ready?
Let's go to the trade show and check out some new machines.
Hey, check out this new website I found.
One thing to note here is that the object comes after check out, unless you use the word it or this. Then we say check it out, not check out it. Now, sometimes you want to explore something not just out of interest, but more carefully to see if it's good for your purposes. Like if you want to buy a new computer, you might scope out some new machines online. You could say check out in this situation, but scope out tells us more clearly that you're looking carefully at something. How about some practice using to scope out? Remember to repeat the examples after you hear them.
We met with Alan to scope out whether he'd be a good partner for us.
We scoped out the new office space before we bought the furniture.
As you can see, to scope out is useful when you're looking at something to make a decision, like if you're choosing a business partner or a new office location. But there's another expression we can use to talk about collecting information or facts, and that expression is to look into. It's quite similar to some meanings of to look at, but is more specifically used to talk about gathering information or doing research. Let's try some more examples with to look into. Once again, repeat the examples after you hear them.
Charlie, could you look into flights to Chicago for next week?
I'm going to the factory to look into the problems that have been reported.
From these examples, you can see that look into can be used for basic information gathering activities. But sometimes you want to talk about looking very deeply into something. Maybe that's some kind of secret which requires more effort. Or maybe it's something that's not so simple to understand. In these situations, we can also use the phrasal verb to dig into. You probably know that to dig is to make a hole in the ground, and you can use dig into to talk about making a serious effort to uncover information. Let's practice to dig into with a couple of examples. Repeat the examples after you hear them.
All right, everyone. Let's dig into this sales report together.
Anne, I'd like you to dig into the website issues this afternoon.
Okay, so we've practiced several phrasal verbs for talking about investigating or examining. But how do these expressions sound in a conversation? Let's listen to a short dialogue between Jack and Dora. Dora has asked Jack to speak with her about something.
Hi, Wendy. You wanted to talk with me?
Yes. Did you check out the latest report?
I did. And it looks like there were some problems.
Indeed. And I'd like you to look into those for me.
Now it's your turn to practice. We'll repeat the dialogue, but this time we're going to beep out the second speaker's words. You will have to say those parts yourself. Remember to start by asking whether Jack checked out the latest report. Then tell him you want to look into the problems. Ready? Here we go.
Hi, Wendy. You wanted to talk with me? I did. And it looks like there were some problems.
Okay, that's all for this lesson about phrasal verbs. We've looked at several expressions about investigating, including to check out, to scope out, to look into, and to dig into. We'll be back soon with some more useful English expressions. Until then, so long and happy learning.